Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Welcome to the first episode of the weekly roundup. As now the channel covers the news from Ukraine daily. Every Sunday from now on, I will be covering the top news this week. And for today, I chose 3 news that I believe have the biggest impact. So we're going to talk about them and we're going to expand on every single one of them and explain in details what it means going forward. So strap yourself in. And we are starting now. In my perspective, the most impactful news this week that we got introduced to is the way that Russians are discussing their budget issues. We have discovered that Russia is in deep problems with their budget, and economists are now projecting that their budget will be reviewed many times over, and the end of the year budget will be, to say it mildly, 10 times larger than it was expected initially. This, of course, creates a lot of issues, but the talks about the issues of the Russian economy has been ongoing for a while now. Most of them were reported by channels such as this one, but it was considered to be fringe discussion, as I am not a military expert or analyst, I'm just a guy on YouTube. But the media, especially Western media, has been recorded on Russian economy being pretty well. However, now it is becoming pretty obvious that Russian economy is not doing well. But unfortunately, for the news that are starting reporting it just now, the signs were always there. And we're going to look at what Insider here wrote, and we're going to look at some other articles that talk about the Russian economy and how it exactly matters for the war effort of Russia that their economy is not doing well. So the first big change that we need to acknowledge is that many Russian economists have already expressed that Russian economy is not doing well, and most of the discussion really spiked around the end of June, July. This was around the time when there was a St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and at that time, a lot of people that have really important names for the Russian economy have started stating that Russian economy will hit a recession at the end of this or next year. And those talks from pretty high-ranking economists have really shuffled a lot of cards, so to say. The forecast, however, explained by the Russian politicians and Russian government was a lot more optimistic. They stated that Russia is doing actually so well that their conservative scenario would outpace even United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada, and it would constitute 1.8% of growth. And this created a little bit of a shift in the perception for Russia. Now, we've heard beforehand that Russian economy was not doing well, as I explained, from the fringe individuals, but it was always the Russian officials that were stating that no, Russian economy is doing well. However, now we see a lot of these independent experts telling that, like, no, Russian economy is doing really bad. We see the budget deficit skyrocketing, and it's pretty much impossible to understand that, yes, it is going to be an issue, because budget deficit is like you plan to not have money, basically. That is what budget is. That was like if your budget just does not have money, and you do not have any kind of obvious way how you can fill that gap, then there is a lot of questions starting to be made. If you just don't have the money, how can you have one of the better performing economies in the world? Like, maybe not in the world, but at least definitely compared to some of the counterparts in UK, France, and Germany. Not that I'm saying that Russian economy is competitive in the same aspect, but you understand what I mean. And if in previous years we could say that there was this piggy bank that Russia accumulated from their super profits of selling oil to the Europeans in decades prior, and that would be true. But the issue they're having now for this year is that everyone knows how much money there is in a piggy bank. It's not that they can hide it. And everyone can see that the amount of money in a piggy bank is a lot less than what is already expected to be the budget deficit, the hole between expenses and income. So if there is just not enough money in a piggy bank saved for the darkest of the days, well, then it's an obvious issue. So not acknowledging that issue in estimates for the growth of the country is obviously a problem. And it is where the manipulation of data and other tactics that Russia is using really comes to show themselves. Now, this would require a separate video, which I maybe am going to do about the way that how it is being manipulated, the Russian GDP. But in very brief terms, Russia is using numbers that are benefiting it, and Russia is also enhancing the numbers in a nominal aspect. So they're stating this like, because of the high inflation in Russia, our numbers are showing that we just have more money, despite the fact that what inflation does basically is devalues the amount that 1 ruble can buy. So, but they say like we have just more rubles in general. Previous year we had like 100 rubles. Now we have 120 rubles. Therefore, we made more money without the acknowledging the fact that there was something done to increase that nominal amount of money, and potentially this 120 is actually, can you buy a lot less than 100 could beforehand. And here is a nice quote to show that from Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. He talks that in 2024, our GDP for the first time exceeded 200 trillion rubles in nominal terms, nearly doubling from the 2020 level. But as it is correctly outlined here by the guys from The Insider, there is little to celebrate because in the hyperinflation era of 1992-1993, nominal GDP doubled every 4 months, if not faster. So it wasn't really that Russia was just getting richer at the 1992-1993 era. So manipulation of prices is ongoing in Russia constantly. That's why it is always interesting to follow some other factors that are trying to calculate what is the real inflation of Russia, what is the numbers that Russians are hiding. And for example, Romir was actually focusing on calculating the average price monthly for specific recipes, so to say, for the things that people eat or the things that people buy. And then they stopped in October 2024, and this was corresponding to the actions by the Russian government to also put certain aspects about the Russian economy into the secret part of the budget. So they were hiding the numbers. And look, for example, some of the latest data from that Romir, they were stating that Russian economy shrunk by 19% in 2022 and was on pace for an additional 10% decline in 2024, though the first 3 quarters of the year, before they start publishing this data. This data obviously doesn't show Russia in a very good light, but what I'm stating is that Russia is waging war on information. That is, whenever I can, I underscore that Russia is a pretend state. And this is the clearest example of a pretend state, that Russia is manipulating and changing data about their economy. But this has been already reported many times over. And it's very nice to see that the Western journals and Western economic advisors and analysts are looking into this, and they are now finally reporting the actual situation. They're taking seriously all of those fringe comments that were told by people like, I don't want to say myself because I'm not an economic analyst, but like the people that actually analyze the data. Because at first they were pushed back as Russian economy just didn't collapse. But as we explained at the time, it's not that Russian economy didn't collapse. To put it simply, what Russia did is they put aside for a later day their problems. They took money from the futures. I know it sounds weird, but that's pretty much what they did. They took the money from the future prosperity of Russia and plugged with that money and those numbers all of the holes that were outlining the absolute economic collapse that Russia had during the 2022-2023. So it seemed for a while that Russia is doing well. And now it is not that Russia suddenly starts collapsing, it's just finally the chickens come to roost, so to say. And the obvious conversation that everyone is having is, what can Russia do to stop all of this? Well, the first thing is that they will start cutting expenses. This is obvious and it is already happening. And right now, this discussion within the Russian society is going to be intensifying. So the Russian society you can say, finally will start feeling the cost of this war waging on them. The problem for the Russian society that a lot of them are not understanding is that even if the war stops now and, for example, all of the sanctions will be lifted off Russia, that the lingering effect of this will continue persisting for decades to come, just because taking money from the future, that action to do was that bad. It is incredible just how much more Russians will pay going in the future. And some people suggest that, but potentially, what Russia can do is they can freeze the ability for the Russian consumers to take the money out of the banks. Because right now, to fight inflation, Russian central bank set the interest rate really, really high, essentially stating that people should not use their money because their money is going to be devalued by the inflation, and instead they could benefit by putting that money into their banks, and then it would start accumulating the interest at a very high rate, therefore at least keeping the money up with the skyrocketing inflation. Unfortunately, the central bank says it will destroy us. So for all of the people, the simple answer, and this is not me stating it, this is the Russian central bank stating it, is that if they freeze the deposits of the Russian population, it will just destroy Russia. So I hope this simple answer, again, you can look into this, you can Google these different things, but the simple answer coming from the Russian central banks is that it would just end us. Well, then the other option, and it seems to be by this point the nominal option, because it is not really understandable how Russians will able to do it, but Russians will start printing the money. Now, printing the money is a whole issue in itself. What Russian central bank essentially tried to do is, because inflation in Russia was skyrocketing, you can think about this as the economy was starting overheating. The temperature in the economy was growing and growing and growing. And to slow down that temperature and growth of the economy that was driven by skyrocketing inflation, the Russian central bank put the high interest rate, essentially putting like an ice compress on the whole thing. So the problem of putting like ice on top of this whole heated situation is that you can overcool. And then you stuck in a way worse situation. Because if you overcool everything, and the problem of cool down economy is that it requires significant effort to restart it. The banks would probably need to lower the interest rate under zero, to put it in negative, just to get people to start doing something in the economy. The problem is that if there is an issue within budget and an issue needs to be plugged in with money, that just generates inflation just by the fact that you solve certain issue that you have with money. Then you just artificially raise the inflation rate. So the money becomes less of itself. So $1 would buy you less than it could before. And then you get paradoxical situation that you have both a very cold economy that is impossible to kind of start off with, that would require basically you to stop inflation, hopefully even make it, like if not negative, but at least zero. But because you're solving other issues by printing money, you're creating artificial inflation. So you can think that the same thing, the central bank would instantly have both super hot something and super cold something. You cannot just slam together something super cold and something super hot and say, on average, this is working fine. And I know I'm simplifying this a lot, and there is a lot better explanations. You can write them in the comments section to help everyone. But the main problem for Russia, why economy is mattering for him, not that the Russian economy is going to collapse. I am not the person that believes that. The Russian economy and generally economies are a lot more robust than a lot of people are assuming. We know that is just a fact of the matter. But the main problem for Russia is the military. Russia has created one of the most toxic situation for their military, because they tried doing the patriotic drive within Russians to fight Ukrainians, but because of the cultural aspects and general narratives, there was not a lot of people that really caught up this general vibe that yes, we definitely need to go punish Ukraine, and I'm ready to go and do it and go die there. No, like while Russians understand the narrative that Ukrainians are not their friends, and definitely there should be someone to defeat those Nazis or whatever you want to say, but the problem is that Russians don't want to go and do it. The only solution that Russians were able to find, and Putin himself was able to find, is just greed. Russian military is built on money. Majority, like over 90% of people that are joining Russian military and that are still in the Russian military are there for the money. So if Russian economy just enters this weird, wild state where the money just gets devalued, where it is unclear who is producing what, if you have things today or not, if you're gonna have payments or not, this creates stupidly high pressure on the Russian finance-based military. The second topic is discussion with regards to Witkoff-Putin meeting, Trump-Putin meeting, exchange of territories within Ukraine. And I'm feeling sort of forced because in my personal opinion, this is not an issue at all. Like there is nothing to talk about here. Yet within a lot of both my audience and a lot of the world audience, there is a lot of misconceptions of the impact of United States, and there is a lot of attention to this. So we still need to talk about it, but I want to underscore and start off with why this is not an issue. And United States have in generally sort of semi-excluded themselves from the issue of Ukraine. United States are not really supporting Ukraine anymore. Like, let's be very clear. Whenever there is help coming from United States anymore, it is not donations. US is not really helping Ukraine in any kind of serious way the taxpayers' money, so to say. It is something that is just being paid for. It's a service, a paid service that is being done, and US is getting paid for it. So in that sense, the best case scenario that we expect from Trump is there. So therefore, all of the discussions about Trump not lifting sanctions, Trump not meeting with Putin or talking some kind of ceasefire, the impact of it has been diminished significantly while United States allows Ukraine buying weapons from the US stockpiles. Because that's, to be honest, the only thing that is really necessary from the United States. That is the plan minimum. That is what United States is doing. Everything else, specifically the discussions that the Europeans and Ukrainians are doing, this is more sort of like trying to play into Trump's ego, and it's more sort of a political theater trying to raise the impact and influence of United States more than it is. Because no matter if there is a discussion between Trump and Putin about anything in Ukraine, if Ukrainians and Europeans that are paying right now, again, for the weapons coming from United States, if Europeans and Ukrainians will not agree to it, then it is all just like good talk, bro. Good for you. That's why I think factually there is not much substance here, and it's mostly just people overreacting on the actual matter. But what is the actual things on the table? Because what happened is Trump was about to impose additional tariffs and sanctions on Russia. At least it was threatened in his rhetoric. And it seemed that Europeans were able to sway Donald Trump more to favor Ukraine, which is not something I was expecting. And again, we see it didn't happen. But it was very unexpected and pleasant for a lot of people. Because remember, especially the polls in the United States, and this is important because when we talk about the Trump administration in action, the population in the United States very massively supports Ukraine and don't support Russia, and they support additional sanctions and additional actions that would support Ukraine and hurt Russia. But what happened is that it seemed to be going well. It seemed that there was a deadline for the additional tariffs and sanctions to be put on Russia, and finally we saw a shift in Trump's rhetoric on Putin. Yet one thing that was announced was that there's going to be Kellogg going to Ukraine, which is, okay, whatever. But there was also Steve Witkoff that kind of disappeared from the stage altogether. Suddenly he appeared in the news that he's going to be on the same day as Kellogg going to Kyiv. He's going to be going to Moscow to talk with Russia. And Witkoff is a fuckboy. Witkoff is Putin's sort of I don't want to say puppet. I believe he doesn't know a thing about diplomacy, and he has not achieved literally anything in his diplomatic effort. The fact that he's going there and talking with Putin is only because the Russians, after meeting with Witkoff, says, wow, such a great meeting. And then Witkoff says, yeah, we had such a great meeting. And then they bring gifts from Putin to Trump, and it supposedly was a great diplomatic visit. Whereas there was no diplomatical substance achieved at all. But we know that this is not how things are being evaluated right now in the US administration. But what happened was exactly that. Because as it turns out, there was three kind of calls meetings between Trump, Witkoff, and European allies Ukraine. So the first call was when Witkoff just met with Vladimir Putin, and then he called Trump, and he basically conveyed that it was such a great meeting. We talked with Russians. It was so amazing. There is going to be potentially some territory going to Russia and so on. And apparently Witkoff was just super excited, and he didn't convey to Trump all of the things clearly enough. I guess they were talking on a very positive note, and Trump said, yeah, we're going. This is when he came out and said, yeah, we're going to have an exchange. Some parts of territory will go to Russia, other parts of territory will go to Ukraine, and that was what initially was discussed. And this was the initial supposed proposal, and some even serious analysts said, well, maybe there is something there. Because, for example, if Russia goes out of Kherson and Zaporizhia, then we're going to see some exchange of territories, and Ukrainians will therefore find a way to maybe get some kind of a ceasefire negotiated. Then on the second meeting, when Witkoff already was in a call present with some of the European leaders and Ukrainians, certain misunderstandings and misconceptions started appearing. For example, that it was not the whole part of the Zaporizhia and Kherson region that supposedly was negotiated, that maybe we could convince the Russians to send off the give away the territory of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is in Russia-controlled area, and potentially parts of the northern occupied territories, very, very small parts of the territories around Kharkiv and Sumy, for the whole part of Donbass, and Russia still keeps everything controlled, plus they legally acknowledged the control of the territories that they've captured. So that is supposedly on the table. Europeans was obviously shocked because that was not the meeting that they were supposed to have, because the meeting they were supposed to have was the meeting where they discuss whether or not Ukraine would be agreeing on some kind of reshuffling, whether there would be additional forces that can be going into Ukraine, those kind of questions. But it turns out it's that's not what's on the table. And then there was basically another third meeting called where Witkoff was put on the spotlight as the poor diplomat that he is, and he had to explain exactly what was proposed by the Russians. And then it was outlined that no, nothing was exactly on the table, that Putin's position has not really shifted 1 inch, that what he's stating is basically Ukraine gets out of the territories that we supposedly claim ours in our constitution, they give away Donbass, potentially they also should be leaving Zaporizhia and other parts that Russia annexed in their constitution, and then after Ukrainians leave those territories and Russian comes in, and this is important, key factor, key word, ceasefire talks start. that this is nothing changed, no changes. It's just Witkoff got overexcited, misunderstood what was said to him, tried to after that follow up with the Russians, and got exposed for an absolute fool and tool that he is. And we saw this being reflected with Trump kind of first announcing that there's going to be a meeting with Putin and Trump, but then starting is like, I am not sure like if there is a good idea, because there is no substance to discuss here. Therefore, Ukrainians obviously came out that there is absolutely no discussion of giving away any Ukrainian territories there. So Witkoff basically, because of his incompetence and because Trump jumping the gun, they just got overexcited out of nothing. And most importantly, now we're in this all clown show. Instead of sanctions being posed on Russia, the only thing that will actually change the outcome of this war, the only way that this war is going to end is by more support for Ukraine, because Russia is not going to stop until it is stopped. And Zelensky says, like, absolutely not. Like, there is no discussion of giving away any territories. The European allies are fully behind Zelensky. And remember, as I said before, if Europeans do not agree, then there is no deal, there is no reason about this. Witkoff is completely in the spotlight, and it's going to be depending now on Kellogg and Rubio, how well they play the card, because those two were the ones that were able to sort of a sideline Witkoff previously and get Trump to try to potentially put more pressure on Russia. But the outcome is very clear, is that all of the sanctions that were supposed to go in force, all of the ultimatums are out of the window. We're now in another round of fuckery, and Putin is just winning time for himself. So the only winner in this situation, and that everyone is here is discussing, is Putin, because he was able to again shift the narratives a bit, and now we're back to this circus. Ukraine is not giving any territories. Ukrainian allies that matter, that supply Ukraine with weapons, are behind Ukraine. They're continuing their supplies. They're discussing how to increase supplies of weapons to Ukraine. So in substance, everything is good. Otherwise, again, as I say, it's non-news, unfortunately, for all of the people that hoped for something else. And the third news is the power that Ukraine still has. General Syrskyi came out with certain important statements, and there is a lot of overlaying matters here. Mostly because for a very long time we saw Ukraine in supposedly some kind of passive stance. But now we're at the middle end of August. This is where Ukrainians last year conducted Kursk operation. And General Syrskyi came out with a very concrete statement stating that we need to act. We cannot win only in defense. And I have been underscoring for myself that indeed Ukrainians have not been using a lot of equipment that I for sure know was supplied to Ukraine, yet we hear nothing about that equipment being used. Why would Ukraine just have resources, sit on those resources and do nothing? And that is indeed not the case. And Syrskyi said that yes, there are operations that are being prepared for potential Ukrainian counteroffensive when the Russians get exhausted. And he has been actually telling this for a while. So I think that this week really outlined very key points for us all to take away. One, that despite the fact that we're hearing about Ukrainians struggling in the front line, we also hear about improvements. You can watch the big video about the problems in the Ukrainian military that I did, and I looked about everything, and I specifically in that video talked about the actions that are being taken by Ukraine to reduce the impact of those issues in Ukraine. And now with Syrskyi coming in and stating very clearly that we are planning military offensives, I think this revitalizes a little bit, at least in some parts of community, the understanding that no, Ukraine has resources. It's just, again, it's a deliberate tactic potentially to give some territory more to that. It's not always happening in an organized fashion. The orders are still there. The bad command is still there. Again, watch the video. But there is definitely something happening there. And second thing, the layer that to this is the Russian Z propagandist. This is a Russian Z propaganda channel, and they're telling that Ukrainians are becoming active on the border regions with Russia. And they're stating this for a while now, stating that we see some accumulation of forces, we see Ukrainians being readied for something, we see things happening, we see diversion groups appearing here and there, we should be ready for any kind of potential Ukrainian advances, because last year they weren't, and it was a problem for them. So beyond that, this channel says about this, Girkin Strelkov, who is now in prison, he's constantly writing that Ukrainians are just sitting there and salivating about the failure Russian offensive, because Russia put a lot of effort in their last winter offensive and this summer offensive, and they achieved very, very little. They achieved territory gains. They achieved some no-name village names. I'm sorry for all Ukrainians who lived in those villages. But in general, they achieved no strategic major breakthroughs. It is all coming at a huge cost, and Ukrainians can exploit that cost once Russians are exhausted. And more importantly, there are some Russian propagandists that are reporting that Ukrainians have actually accumulated 50 to 60,000 people, and they're preparing to use them at some point. So data supposedly is there in a Russian possession. Not that I'm trusting the Russian sources, but I'm just stating that there is a lot of people talking that Ukrainians are having resources and they're considering how they can use those resources. And this is overlaying together with additional reform that is happening within the Ukrainian military, with the reform about their corps system rather than brigade system. So potentially we could see better command of operations. And Syrskyi the same week additionally coming out with a very important message that is now being politically neglected by a lot of Ukrainian politicians because it's toxic, is the question of mobilization within Ukraine. For a very long time, I was very, very hopeful that Ukrainians and Ukrainian society specifically will have a serious discussion how mobilization efforts should go on and what is the goals that their country needs to achieve. And I believe that this is obviously for Ukrainians to decide. I'm not going to give any advice, but I'm happy to see that there is a beginning coming from the general-in-chief himself about the potential mobilization efforts. I would love to see that there is some kind of operation that, again, is going to be unexpected and going to blow the pants off of everyone that was doubting Ukraine. And then we see some kind of additional discussion within Ukrainian society about their mobilization effort and how they should be solving issues within the Ukrainian military. So it's very good news that it is all happening. Those are the 3 news of the weekly roundup. Thank you so much for watching this. I love you guys. Slava Ukraini. Keep supporting Ukraine. Keep believing in Ukrainian armed forces. And I will see you next time.